Nobel Peace Prize laureate Aung San Suu Kyi is back under house arrest in Myanmar, facing trumped-up charges of illegally importing walkie-talkies. The military deposed her and the country's elected government on Monday, declaring a state of emergency for the next 12 months. Its head claimed the army's hand was forced by mass voter fraud in November's elections, which Aung San Suu Kyi's party won by a landslide. She called for supporters to protest the intervention, but is it too late? Our title, Myanmar Coup, Death Knell for Democracy? Welcome to The Point. It's a pleasure to introduce our guests. Jasmin Lorch works for the Independent Social Science Research Institute, Giga, and she says the international community has been living in denial for a long time. The military has never really wanted to see real democratic change in Myanmar. And with us is Felix Heiduk from the Berlin-based policy and science think tank SWP. His opinion? The coup has put an end to Myanmar's illiberal and partly authoritarian transition to democracy. And it's great to welcome my colleague Sou-Jie van Brunnersum from DW's Asia desk. She thinks the military seizure of power could lead to deadly violence. The military will reinforce a culture of abuse and impunity, threatening to end human rights and economic stability in Myanmar. So let me go straight away to you, Sou-Jie, with that mention of deadly violence in your opening statement. So far, the streets appear to be relatively calm. So how would you assess the potential for bloodshed going forward?
The way that I see it, that the reason people are not protesting just yet en masse is, I think, for the reason that they are very scared. And they know that the military has had a very brutal history of violence. And the people in the generation that saw the 1988 uprising and violent crackdown on anti-government protesters and witnessed their family members slaughtered before their eyes, this is a sort of déjà vu for them. And so this is just a reminder of what the military is capable of, and that the reason they are not protesting yet. I think they will find more creative ways. Only time will tell. But for now, most people, the number one concern, I think, when people woke up in Myanmar on Monday was the fear of their security, of their loved ones and their own safety. Can I go back out in the street as before, because they know that in the time when the military ruled, it was a whole different life.
Jasmin, you say the military never truly wanted democratic change. Nevertheless, it's decided to tear down the democratic facade it had tolerated. Why now?
Well, I think a major reason are the November 2020 elections, in which the NLD was confirmed in power in a landslide victory.
The NLD being Aung San Suu Kyi's party.
Being Aung San Suu Kyi's party that had basically led the liberalization or opening process. And I think the military and the party it backs, the USDP, had also overestimated their own showing in these elections, even though that's surprising because it was probably obvious that people still overwhelmingly supported the NLD. So I think the NLD being reconfirmed in power was a major reason, because the military might have been afraid, or was probably afraid, that NLD would now push further reforms, perhaps by amending the constitution of 2008, which the military had drafted originally in order to preserve many of its domains, or by more subtle ways, such as making the administration more civilian and get it out of military control. So with this reconfirmation that the NLD might grow more powerful in restricting the power of the military.
And Felix, let me get your take on the same point. Jasmin just mentioned the military had actually established control over certain domains. In fact, behind that democratic facade that I mentioned, many political offices and 25% of parliamentary seats were reserved for army officers. Why is that no longer enough for the military?
I think that's not the point here. The point is that the military, obviously, for reasons unbeknownst to me, felt that these prerogatives were threatened because of this landslide election victory in November 2020. And the fear, I can only speculate, obviously, on this, but the fear seems to have been that Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD would now make good on their promise, on their election campaign promise, for charter change, for constitutional change, and also for further demilitarization. That's where I agree with Jasmin's statement, further demilitarization of the administration of the civil service in the country, and so on and so forth. So here we see that some of those authoritarian prerogatives that the military basically safeguarded into the new democratic era were actually, in the view of the military, threatened.
So the facade was cracking. Suu-Jie, the state of emergency is supposed to last a year, followed by a free and fair election. I'm quoting there. That was the announcement made by the military. So what's likely to happen during this 12-month period? And can we expect the army to keep its promise that whoever wins the election following that will actually govern?
I think there are two different sides to the coin. People do say that the military in Myanmar do keep up to their word, that they do fulfill, even though those words of promises might be somewhat brutal, they have fulfilled what they would do. For example, they have always held elections. The last elections were reheld after they promised that. However, I also think that the military, this coup on Monday, has also proven just how irrational they are and how little they are actually thinking of the well-being of the people of Myanmar. And I think everything on Monday, this very coup in itself, just shows that the military is capable of very irrational behaviour and that they cannot keep their promises and prioritise the people of Myanmar.
Let's hear a few voices from the people of Myanmar. Aung San Suu Kyi has urged her supporters to show their opposition, but so far the streets have been fairly quiet. Nonetheless, the anger is palpable.
I feel the army assaulted the people when it staged this coup on the civilian government, elected by our people. Our country is just a bird, learning to fly. Now the army broke our wings. I'm terribly upset. I have been crying all day. I've been crying all day. He's the bad guy. How could he do something like this?
Jasmin, the he in that last statement refers to the army's commander-in-chief, Min Aung Hlaing. When the National League for Democracy, the NLD, came into power in 2016, the general appeared in public with Aung San Suu Kyi. He seemed satisfied to work with her. So what changed for him personally? Some media are saying corruption may be partly at stake here. Is that right?
Well, I think on this point we can really only speculate because the military proper, the core for us is mainly a black box. For observers, I mean, he has been the army chief of staff for a long time already. And he seemed for a while, as you said, to be comfortable with this power sharing arrangement with the military holding the security-relevant ministries, with the NLD having the ministries and the functions that relate to the purely civilian domains, such as labour policy, economic policy. Well, we know that he and his family are also involved in a lot of businesses, hold monopolies over certain businesses, have interests there. But I think the main, which perhaps also relates a bit to the question of whether the military is irrational, I think what we really have to understand that it's a military mindset, you know? It's a military thinking. It's about can they still control the process in the way they want it? And this goes back to my own statement. I mean, they never wanted to have a liberal democracy. What they wanted to have was what they call disciplined, flourishing democracy. So, you know, are they still in control of the whole process? And is also the military as a core, is it intact as a unit, is functioning? Are its interests not threatened? So I think this is what they're really at.
Let me ask you, Felix, to give us a sense of whether you think that many people in Myanmar share the opinion of those voices that we heard in that report. The fact is, so far we've seen only isolated protests in response to Monday's coup. But would you expect more opposition? Would you expect that to gain momentum?
I think these sentiments are widely shared. That's what I would assume, at least, given the data that's available on this. And I think anger is mounting as well amongst the general population because of the little support the coup actually has. And military interventions into politics generally have very, very little support in Myanmar because of Myanmar's particular history. However, the question seems to be then, and what's next? Will there be will it gain momentum? Will it be one way or the other via Twitter? Facebook has been shut down effectively as of today. Via Twitter or other social media channels, will there be some sort of organization of mass protest? Will people come out in force? I think that's what we need to look out for.
Suu-Kyi, would you say there's anything behind the army's claims that there were irregularities during the election? Has there been any proof of that from independent observers?
No, so most international observers have said that the election was largely fair and transparent. And also there are commentators that are kind of comparing the military's reaction to after how Donald Trump reacted after the election, claiming it was rigged and it was a fraud. And I think similarly, the military is using this tactic to kind of stall time and to plan their next move. And but however, most international observers are saying that it was over 75 to 80% that they voted for Aung San Suu Kyi's Democratic Party.
Jasmin, international observers have also been commenting with quite a bit of surprise about the charges against Aung San Suu Kyi. As I mentioned, she's accused of having illegally imported 10 walkie-talkies, which seems laughable and hardly like a substantial basis for discrediting a Nobel Peace Prize laureate. Do these charges nonetheless have potentially serious consequences?
They do. They obviously do. I mean, the law under which she was charged is really notorious. It's very vague, and it was also used during military rule to imprison opponents. That's one thing. Actually, I think the most important background is that once somebody is convicted of criminal charges, he or she cannot run for office again. So I think this is the main strategy behind it, that they want to keep her from running for office next time when elections are held. Yeah, you were also asking whether whether elections will be held in a year's time or whenever. I think they might actually hold elections, but before they will create an uneven playing field. And part of this is to bar Aung San Suu Kyi from running.
So the elections in November, as has been mentioned, were in fact won with a landslide by Aung San Suu Kyi's National League for Democracy. Despite some recent stains on her reputation, the Nobel Peace Prize laureate, who spent nearly 15 years under house arrest during her long resistance to military rule, is revered at home in Myanmar.
Aung San Suu Kyi is respected around the world. She's been the recipient of numerous honors, including the European Parliament's Sakharov Prize and the Nobel Peace Prize. In 2010, her growing popularity combined with mounting international pressure finally forced Myanmar's military junta to lift her house arrest and grant democratic concessions. 5 years later, her NLD party won an absolute majority in the first free elections. Suu Kyi became the country's Minister of Foreign Affairs and de facto head of government. But the military, led by Army Chief Min Aung Hlaing, retained its grip on power, meaning that Suu Kyi remained a head of government at the mercy of the military. As a result, basic democratic freedoms like freedom of the press and protection for minorities remained elusive during her time in power. Is this the end of Aung San Suu Kyi?
Felix, let me pass that last question right on to you. Is this the end of Aung San Suu Kyi, the end of her ability to influence political developments in her country?
Well, I wouldn't say so. I think that we must differentiate between the formal political process, and there I agree with Jasmin. It very much looks like these trumped-up charges will quite possibly lead to her essentially becoming barred from running for public office. That includes actually the wider NLD leadership. She won't be the only one. That's what I expect, that will be charged on some walkie-talkie or what have you incident violating COVID rules. There will be some fabrications in that direction by the military government. I'm pretty certain on that. However, outside of the formal political process, street politics, mobilization of the opposition, and so on and so forth, I don't think she will disappear from the public mind anytime soon. Maybe that's what the generals are hoping for, but I can't see that happening because the newer history of Myanmar, also with regards to her over a decade of house arrest, shows that she was never really away in terms of wielding political influence, however informal that was.
Let me ask you a quick follow-up question relating again to your opening statement, which referred to the illiberal and partly authoritarian transition to democracy. Did she actually achieve anything substantive for her country in terms of moving toward democracy, or was she in the end essentially a marionette of the military?
No, I wouldn't say the latter is true. I don't think she was a marionette in any way of the military. I think in certain aspects, she wasn't anti-military. There were quarrels with the military leadership. But for example, if you look at the Rohingya issue, if you look at also the treatment of other ethnic minorities, you can see that she shared some of the sentiments, shall we say, that are prevalent in the military, but also in the wider population, on how to deal with ethnic strife, on how to deal with quote-unquote illegal immigrants, because this was the title or the reference used for the Rohingya. So there you can see, I think, some sort of coming together. However, essentially, since 2012, we have this almost zero-sum logic conflict between the NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi on the one hand, and the military on the other, over who basically runs the state. So I don't think she was a marionette at all. They were really butting heads, and over the last year, this has really hardened. And from what we know, communication actually between the military leadership and the civilian leadership led by Aung San Suu Kyi effectively had broken down for quite some time.
So, Suu Kyi, your opening statement mentioned human rights, but Aung San Suu Kyi, in the end, was no unsullied advocate of human rights. As just mentioned, she actually denied that ethnic violence was being perpetrated by the military against Rohingya Muslim communities. And she even traveled to The Hague to defend her country against charges of genocide. Was that her own doing, do you think, or would she have been compelled to do so by the military?
So there's a lot of speculation and different controversies around this topic, but I think that Aung San Suu Kyi, the genocide acts against the Rohingya people were committed primarily at the leadership of the military. And as we have discussed before, the military actually holds a lot more power. They always have in Myanmar. And Aung San Suu Kyi, some people have said she is kind of the pawn of the military to some extent. And it's always a question about compromise. How far is she willing to what extent can we fight for democracy at the hands of bloodshed? So she has denied genocide against the Rohingya people, even though the United Nations and the International Criminal Court, they have found extensive evidence of widespread violence and genocidal acts against the Rohingya people. However, to the extent that we know that Aung San Suu Kyi is personally responsible, she is just the face of many people responsible for these acts of violence. And this is, I think, the big debate also is where, like, to what are we willing to fight for democracy, in what name? Because all these people, or Rohingya people in Rakhine State, thousands have been killed. And yes, I think Aung San Suu Kyi, she was trying to keep the military and her party and the struggle for democracy on a level. And people say that if she had spoken sooner against the Rohingya, then maybe the coup would have happened sooner.
Let me ask you, Jasmin, about Commander-in-Chief Min Aung Hlaing's own implication or own involvement in the violence. He has been condemned internationally, including by the United Nations Human Rights Council, and sanctioned for his role in the violence perpetrated against the Rohingya. So what would you say this coup, which gives him more power, will mean for Muslim communities in Myanmar?
Well, I think the situation will worsen. What we have seen so far will worsen. I mean, already when the ethnic cleansing against the Rohingya was committed, the civilian parts of the government did not have much control over what happened in Rakhine State. And Aung San Suu Kyi is definitely to blame for not defending the Rohingya, for not coming out in defense of the Rohingya, for not defending human rights, even though she was a human rights icon at the time. But the civilian parts of the government didn't control the situation on the ground. And it was the military who controlled the situation on the ground, and it still does in Rakhine State. And what's added on now is that we have even less transparency of what's actually happening in these areas, even less oversight, even though there has never been proper civilian oversight to speak of in the first place.
Felix, looking at the clock, don't have a lot of time left, so I would like to talk about the international community and what it can and should do in response to the coup. The United Nations Security Council met, but took no action, not least, of course, because of Russian and Chinese influence. The U.S. State Department and the German Cooperation Ministry are thinking about cutting off support. Would that make a difference? Should countries even be considering sanctions against the military regime, or would that simply push Myanmar into the arms of China?
Well, for start, sanctions already do exist because of the Rohingya crisis and coming from the EU, coming from the US. So that's already the case. I think it's very likely that they will be extended and expanded in the wake of the military coup. For the sole reason that I think Western governments won't stand by in the face of a military coup and will basically launch sanctions in response. Will they make a difference? That's a different question. There, my answer would be most likely not. At least not in the short or mid-term perspective. Why? Because of, if we look at the Myanmar's history and especially the role of the military, we see that it has been for quite some time sort of immune to external pressures. That includes sanctions. The generals have actually done fairly okay, even during the heydays of Myanmar essentially being a pariah state internationally, through their business dealings with China, through moving money to Singapore, to Hong Kong and other places. So it really affects badly the general population, especially the poor people in the country. But it's not the right angle, I think, to really put a lot of pressure on the military itself.
Suu-Jie, your statement mentioned economic fallout from the coup. In fact, Myanmar's economy flourished as the generals were relaxing their grip. Do you think that will change? Will this deter foreign investment? Briefly, if you would.
Yes, I think that now that Myanmar's under coup for a year, this will severely at least impact the tourism industry. Myanmar has come to open its doors to many tourists. At one point, Myanmar had one of the highest percentage of new coming tourists in the world. And now that's all shut down. And tourists are probably, they are too scared of the situation. The security situation is not good for tourism at this time. And a lot of people rely on the informal economy in tourism to make ends meet.
Jasmin, let me very quickly come back to our title, Death Knell for Democracy, and ask whether you think the prospects for democracy, medium to long term, are now dead?
For democracy, yes. I mean, what I'm basically expecting to see is a situation like under the Thein Sein government, when the military liberalized a bit and opened up the country a bit between 2010 and 2011, but remained fully in charge also of the political handlings of the country through its proxy party, the USDP. And I think we're likely to see a similar scenario in the future after the military holds some form of unfair elections.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you for being with us. Thanks to you out there for tuning in. See you soon.